The next federal election is just about 9 months out. Our countdown clock is running, and Canada is looking to avoid a repeat of what happened to its neighbours in 2016. Today, the government announced, to that effect, a sweeping plan to fight election interference, including a new team that is supposed to alarm Canadians if their democratic right is being undermined. The CBC's David Cochran is here with the details. Let's start with that team. What exactly is it, and what will it do?
Yeah, it's a committee, Vashi, and it's important to stress that this is only going to be in place during the actual election campaign period, during what you call the writ period, when the government's in caretaker mode. Outside of that, it's up to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to deal with this. So it's a committee of 5 people, some of the most senior bureaucrats in government: the Clerk of the Privy Council, the National Security Advisor, and the Deputy Ministers of Justice, Public Safety, and Global Affairs Canada. So you've got senior people used to making fast decisions, dealing with incomplete information at times, as would likely happen in an incident like this, but with extensive knowledge of national security and foreign affairs. So they would meet once they get an assessment of election meddling or disinformation campaigns and assess it and decide whether to go public and tell the public, and of course to tell the political parties. Now, if they do this, if they do decide they're going to flag something during a campaign, they might be able to tell you this is going on and this is what it is and you should disregard it because of these reasons it's not true, or this is a security threat it poses to the election. They may not be able to say who's behind it because there still needs to be an investigation, a forensic examination. Maybe you can imagine with digital interference what would happen there. It would take some time, but they will let you know that something is happening. The question we all have is, what's the threshold for reporting? When does it get to the point of being so completely disruptive that the public needs to know about it? And the answers on that were very unclear. Context specific was what they're saying. It reminded me of the famous quote from Judge Potter Stewart in the United States, who was asked to define what pornography was. He says, "I know it when I see it." They will know what the threat to the election is when they see it. It could be one big catastrophic event or a series of minor events that build to a large misinformation campaign. So that's what they'll be looking at, taking inputs from the national security apparatuses, from social media companies and citizens, and assessing it, and then deciding to go public with it. What it is not is also important. This is not a fact checker. This is not a referee for the campaign. If Andrew Scheer wants to lie about Justin Trudeau and Trudeau wants to lie about Andrew Scheer, that's for the media, that's for the parties, that's for the voters. It is not for this committee. This is about covert attempts to manipulate the election through disinformation or voter suppression in ways that can affect a proper functioning democracy. That's what they're going to focus on, not spins and lies in politics.
And what we know from some of those campaigns in other countries is that they emerge through various social media vehicles. Yeah. What is the government saying about social media companies and all of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Canada seems kind of poised to do something that a lot of people might be nervous about, and that's kind of rely on the goodwill of social media companies and give them the benefit of the doubt, because there's no new laws or legal requirements here for Twitter or Facebook or whatever to change their behavior. Now, they have legislated changes requiring them not to take foreign money for political advertising and to have a public registry of political ads, so there's transparency there. But the non-advertising content, the disinformation, the bots, all of that, they're relying on Twitter or Facebook and all social media to sort of improve their practices and saying that, look, these companies recognize they've damaged their public trust. In the UK, millions of people had their information used during the Brexit campaign. In the US, and Twitter bots went crazy in the final weeks of the US presidential election. So they need to make efforts to repair trust there. But this is one of the big concerns that Nathan Cullen, the critic for the NDP, had about this, and that there's nothing here that forces social media to do anything. Here's what he had to say today.
The social media outlets that can weaponize a lie on their platform are not required to do anything substantive in this conversation about spreading mis- and disinformation to Canadian voters in our elections.
So not required to do it, but Twitter and Facebook have both sent a statement saying they're going to work on this, they're going to cooperate with the government, they believe in these good intentions. And Ralph Goodale, the Public Safety Minister, was part of this announcement, says there is past practice on this. There is a track record here on issues such as terrorism and on human trafficking or child exploitation. Social media platforms have worked with government agencies in various countries to make changes there. So they say it was slow getting going, but it has gotten better. Here's what Ralph Goodale had to say.
It took a while to get the traction, but the responsiveness has increased over that period of time. Many countries are now raising with them this same point about foreign interference in elections. So the topic will not come as a surprise to any of them.
Not going to come as a surprise, but it's a big job. As you can see on the countdown clock there, 263 days to get it all figured out, because that's when Canadians go to the polls.
They sure do. Thanks a lot, David. The CBC's David Cochran. So what is the government doing about that criticism? Will they be able to make social media companies comply? Karina Gould is the Minister of Democratic Institutions, and she joins us now. Hi there. Nice to see you, Minister. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I appreciate it. So I want to start off with some questions on the announcement that you made today. What will the threshold be for the, and I want to get the name right, the new incident protocol group to be able to actually announce and make public what they deem interference?
So the threshold will be kind of context dependent, but what's important is that it will be a very high threshold because it will have to call into question the integrity of having a free and fair election. But what I can say is that this protocol was developed based on the previous 2 years of experience that we've seen with foreign interference in other elections around the world. So something like what happened in the United States or the UK or France would be of a similar magnitude here in Canada.
So what's an example, though, of something that could happen? Like if you're using the United States as an example, we've heard lots of stories of interference there. What is an example of interference that would actually necessitate this group coming forward?
Well, as I said, it's important to remember that it will depend on the context because it could be something that is a one-off event or it could be a culmination of many things that have occurred over a period of time or the lead up in the election. And so, you know, when we think about, you know, the Macron leaks, for example, and this is very hypothetical, that's something that may warrant the group getting together. But it's important to note that we've set up this group of high-level senior civil servants to make that decision during the election period, and so ultimately it will be up to them.
They are high-level senior servants, but many of them are appointed by your government. How can, you know, can Canadians really be sure that they don't have the interests of your party put first and foremost?
So civil servants serve government no matter which stripe it's in, and particularly during the election period, that's during the caretaker convention when typically senior servants ensure the continuity of government. And so this is their decision. They will inform political party leaders, all of them at the same time during an election. And so this process is put in place really and announced today so that Canadians do have confidence in both the message and the messenger. And it's done in an impartial, nonpartisan way because this is much above partisan politics.
I take your assurances, but I mean, the NDP is singling out the fact that that first of all, the chief electoral officer isn't in this group, but also that, you know, the National Security Advisor, deputy ministers, clerk of the PCO, most of those are appointed by the government, and they're concerned that, you know, the government might then have their interests put first and foremost, that they instead might be looking more for interference that is to the advantage of yours and disadvantage of another party.
So this is really important that you raise this because it's important to note that the chief electoral officer obviously has the trust of Canadians because we've had a chief electoral officer for a long time that administers free and fair elections. However, the chief electoral officer is an independent officer of Parliament and not a member of the government. When we're talking about something of this magnitude, this is about Canadian national security and about the Government of Canada making a decision. And so it's important to maintain the separation between what is an independent agency of Parliament and the Government of Canada. But what's also really important, Vashi, and I'm glad you brought this up because I would push back a little bit on the NDP member who's a critic and his job is to criticize, but we've actually set this process up in a way that we've had half a dozen meetings with the different political parties that have fed input into the development of this protocol and into the process, and we will continue to engage with them over the next 9 months.
Yeah, but have they
to make
endorsed
sure
the picks on this? I mean, have they signed off?
They have been fully aware the entire time, and we have also announced today that each political party leader, as well as key individuals and officials within each political party, will have security clearance to get routine briefings from our security agencies, and they will be part of this because it's important that this is above partisanship, and that's why we're putting this process in place.
I guess the question on the chief electoral officer was raised, though, because that role is the person who's in charge of ensuring the integrity of our elections. That's the function.
That role is in charge of administering our elections.
But they also are doing a lot of things to ensure the integrity of the voting process, which is part and parcel of, you know, ensuring the the integrity of democracy.
With regards to national security incidents, this will be our national security agencies. They will obviously be in contact with the chief electoral officer, but the chief electoral officer's job is to administer the elections. And we have confidence in the chief electoral officer as well. I mean, C-76 just increased the chief electoral's authority to be able to communicate about elections with Canadians, to educate them about elections and to ensure that they have the tools and the resources necessary to enforce the elections.
They won't just be privy to what this committee is.
They are also working with CSE to ensure that their systems are protected as well. So they play a fundamental role. However, for the purposes of informing the Canadian public, we feel, and we've had many consultations with all of the major political parties who have been part of this, that it needs to be a group, and it's important that there are 5. It's not just one official making this decision, because it can have significant impacts on how Canadians interpret the election as well.
You say that you're, quote, expecting social media platforms to act responsibly, but what consequences will there be if they don't?
So we have already legislated social media companies in C-76 to do 2 things. One of which is to have an ad registry for all political advertising, both during the pre-writ and writ period, as well as to not knowingly accept any foreign funding for political advertisements. So we haven't been afraid to legislate social media thus far. We are entering into conversations. I've initiated those conversations about what we are expecting. The first thing is that if they have actions that they're taking in other jurisdictions to protect their elections, so for example, the upcoming parliamentary elections in the EU, we expect that they implement those measures here in Canada.
What does expect mean, though? Like, what is the and I'm asking because we're talking about actors here who have, Zuckerberg doesn't show up at committee hearings in Europe that he's invited to, that right now they're under fire because they've changed the way that they code their advertising so that third parties like ProPublica can no longer determine where those ads, who's paying for those ads, or where they're coming from on sites outside of Facebook. So we're not talking about innocent actors here. So what beyond expectations is your government going to do to ensure they comply with what you've set out today?
Well, I think they've seen that we haven't been afraid to legislate them in the past, and so that I'm hopeful that these discussions will result in tangible actions, and if not, then we'll have to see what next measures are needed.
What kinds of things would you consider for next measures? I mean, would there be penalties? I take your point that you're hopeful and that the conversations are ongoing, but I really do think in this case they have shown themselves in certain instances to truly kind of not care. Well, and act really in their own self-interest.
I think that Canadians and citizens around the world have expectations about how social media platforms act, particularly when it comes to the democratic sphere and particularly when it comes to our elections. And the social media platforms have to earn the trust again of their users to ensure that they, are providing that authentic, transparent, integral service.
But after everything that happened, they're still changing their code so that we can't find out where their ads come from.
So this is why we're having these conversations now, right? In the lead up to the election, we will have to see how those conversations go, and then we'll reevaluate when the time is necessary.
Okay, I have to ask you about one other issue before you leave. Your former caucus colleague, Raj Grewal, reportedly was able to raise $600,000 at a single night's fundraiser while he was still a Liberal MP. The public can't find out for sure if it was $600,000. The party won't say at this point. There will eventually be filings that become public, but right now the rules, as created by your government, the extra rules that were created, to be fair, don't cover MPs. They just cover ministers and leadership candidates. Should those rules be expanded so that the public can know more about where this money is coming from and where it goes?
Well, the financing rules do cover members of Parliament, and when the reporting happens, they will be able to look at the money that was raised, and if it was over $200, it will be publicly reported.
But now, for example, if this was you would release a list of names at the end, right? And that doesn't happen now, and your party won't say how much was raised.
Right. When we created Bill C-50, we did so very deliberately that it would include cabinet ministers and leaders of parties, because those are individuals that either are directly making decisions or are seeking to govern Canadians to make those decisions. And we were very deliberate in that. Of course, we always look forward to recommendations and suggestions. However, I do think that we do have fairly robust financing rules right now, and the way that it works, it will be disclosed in the future.
Do you understand, though, how for some Canadians it might not pass the sniff test that someone who admitted that he owed all this gambling money and now, then resigned and now is staying on and now says he's paid it all off, and usually only $100,000 is spent. There's a limit to how much you can spend in a campaign.
I'm not entirely familiar with the case right now, but what I would say is that if money were raised, it can only go towards a political party, not a personal initiative. It would go into the party bank account that's registered, or the EDA bank account that's registered with Elections Canada, and so that information would then be disclosed on Election Canada's website.
And why won't your party just say how much was raised?
You're asking questions that I don't have the answers to, but I think what's important here is to remember that we do have robust laws when it comes to party fundraising here in Canada, and that information will be disclosed as long as those donations were over $200. However, donations that are under $200, Elections Canada also has, they're just not posted on the website. So we do have transparency in the process, and
it takes a while to get there.
You just gotta, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Appreciate your time. That was Democratic Reform Minister Karina Gold from earlier on the show. We talked about the government's attempt to counter any election interference this fall by creating a 5-member team as well as an intelligence agency task force. Welcome back to Power in Politics and the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro, Andrew Cash, Tim Powers, and Chris Hall. Amanda, I'll start with you. One of the big sort of points of criticism from the opposition is around the role social media platforms play in the idea of interference, especially what happened in the U.S. and other countries. When I asked the minister about it, what kind of consequences those companies would face if they didn't adhere to the kinds of things that the government was talking about today, she said they were in conversations, and they might be willing to look at legislation at some point, but really was kind of vague on it. What kind of power does the government have here? Should they have a more robust plan in dealing with these companies?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about the issue for a minute, because it's interesting when I think a lot of people, they hear the idea of government or of election interference, and it's like, that sounds like an episode of West Wing. Is this real? Is this really happening? It is. It's happened in some major elections in the U.S., in the UK, in France. It matters. So I think the fact that the government has made this a priority, put it front and center, tried to put some preventative measures in place was the right thing to do, was the smart thing to do. It was certainly one of the concerns coming out of 2015. As it relates to companies, this is tricky because, what is happening on social media and how third parties are purchasing advertising, putting information out as news, and people are consuming that information has huge implications in the next election. So to try to tackle it and get in front of it is what the government should be doing, but there's a lot of challenges in doing that with private companies. So what oversight does the government have right now? Not that much. And I think that's why the government is engaging in those conversations and then striking up a task force to understand what they could be doing. Is there more that could be done, potentially in the area of legislation, in order to make it a really level playing field in the next election?
Like most government initiatives, this comes with a lot of flash, whether it has any substance. I think in principle, the idea of trying to do something is important, but in reality, Amanda's outlined some of the challenges, but the government are creating a challenge for themselves. First of all, if you bring in old Marshall McLuhan now, if the media, if the message is in fact the medium of adjudication here is going to be government, faceless bureaucrats who all may be very capable, but if you're a citizen and you're already skeptical, and you're looking at government officials telling you this is good and this is bad, you're going to still be kind of skeptical in some quarters. Certainly in some parts of the country that is going to take place. From what I've seen in today's announcement, I've not read the legislation yet, or the announcement. I know, shocking. I bet nobody else has. But it seems to be focused on foreign actors and foreign interests, and that's where a lot of the things have happened in the U.S. and the UK. How are people going to interpret or manage domestic disturbances? And I think the minister
was... How do you define them?
And then how do you define them? And the final point I would have is, this notion of media literacy. Again, we'd all support that, but how are you going to get, media literacy is not going to happen in 9 months. And you can run some great ads and tell people they should know more, but that's a nice feel-good thing. Is it going to matter substantively? Not to a large enough degree, I think, by the time the election comes around.
Certainly in an election period, people are inundated from messages in their mailbox, their actual mailbox, their mailbox, and then to just sort of suggest to Canadians, well, make sure you check different sources to make sure, to try to even out the reporting. But look, I think this is a good start. We have a serious issue here on our hands, and what to me is very strange is that the government seems to want to use the honor system for these massive corporations like Facebook and Google, and that's where I think there's a very big gap. The minister said, well, we expect that that Facebook will do the right thing, but we've already seen quite recently that in fact they don't do the right thing. And this should be very concerning. I see nothing in this legislation that really looks at that. And furthermore, what is the role of the Chief Electoral Officer in this?
Not included in this.
And also, what is the role of the CRTC in this? And I have a lot of faith in the bureaucracy, in the Canadian bureaucracy. I think we've got some excellent people there. But Canadians are skeptical. At the door, Canadians are skeptical about government and increasingly about the news that they're getting. And, I'm concerned that, just a sort of closed shop, government-appointed special committee, even if they're doing good work, is not going to necessarily pass the smell test for Canadians.
I'm not as concerned by the people they've appointed as this task force to oversee it, although I take the points that it might have been better to have a broader group, including an officer of Parliament like the Chief Electoral Officer. I was concerned about the threshold, contextualize what would be deemed important enough to inform Canadians that some messages that they're getting are not accurate, or that a campaign targeting a particular candidate isn't accurate. It's not clear to me at what point that would kick in. The other one that I thought was really important in all of this is as you look through what they're trying to propose here, it goes to what everybody else has mentioned, that they expect social media platforms to act in a certain way. We already know that Facebook has changed some of the coding it does to prevent access by ProPublica and other groups to monitor not only who the advertisings are going to, but the demographics of those people, these kinds of issues. So if Facebook is already showing it's not prepared to open up its database, it seems to me that there's a big problem here that people won't necessarily know who are they being targeted by, and more importantly, why they're being targeted with these messages. So if you're hoping for a different kind of outcome, this is at least a start, but there obviously are a long way to go. I would note one last thing. The EU has its own measures that they're bringing in. I think it's in May. Anyway, soon. I'll be interested to compare what they're doing versus what we're doing and whether there's things that we should adapt to. That said, we're 10 months out, so at least there's enough time to be able to make a change. We're not in the middle of a writ period or an election campaign, so we can't be accused of having tried to stack the deck.
I don't want to go all tinfoil hat again, though some would accuse me of wearing that perpetually. But what were we talking about last week? Last week we were talking about...
I couldn't even tell you. Yeah.
Well, I know. It was so gripping. But at one point we were talking about the Canada Food Guide. Canada Food Guide, a central document of government telling Canadians how to behave. And then all of a sudden we learned the Canada Food Guide, the same government-driven document, was all wrong. This skepticism around the messenger that Andrew and I have talked about, I think, is going to be real and deliberate and take away from a lot of the good work an entity like this can do. There's a reason in the United States, for good or for bad, they have a third-party presidential commission. I think a better approach here would be to find eminent Canadians. Not that these public servants aren't.
Not that commission stopped Russia in the last election.
Well, no, but I think, again, to have it believable, for it not to be termed fake news from the start, you have to have believable and credible messengers who have faces and aren't faceless bureaucrats who may be wonderful people that the Canadian public don't know.